Hello, welcome to Jason the Old Millennial. My name is Jason. I'm speaking to you here in my basement in the great state of Kansas. And today I'm doing a book review, something different I haven't done on the channel. I like to read a lot of books. And one of my favorite subject matters is the Beatles. I love reading books about the Beatles, and both about the band, about the individuals themselves. I love learning as much as I can. I love watching documentaries. Beatles are just one of my favorite subject matters to read about and watch and get to know as much as I can, because I'm such a huge Beatles fan. I think they're the greatest band in the world, not only musically, but I mean pop culture wise. Been just a huge influence on everything up to today. I mean, as far as rock music goes and culture. Anyway, so I want to talk about a book that I own, that pretty popular book. I've read too a couple years ago. It is called Tune In. Let's see, I think it's The Beatles All These Years, Volume 1 by Mark Lewisohn. I got a little bit of a tear there. But yeah, there's Mark Lewisohn down there, the author. If you can tell, it's a pretty thick book. It's about 800 pages long. And this is, anybody that's a Beatle fan that likes to read about Beatles, this is like the #1 book to read to really get information about the Beatles. It is the most detailed book I've ever read about the Beatles, and it's only Volume 1. This is the first of 3 books that Mark Lewisohn is writing about the Beatles. And this, yeah, most detailed book anybody's ever read about the Beatles, and this is only the first volume. It's such an interesting book in some couple different ways. One, as I said, it's about 800 pages long. It's a pretty good sized book. I forget how much it was. It's a fairly more expensive book than normal books I get. 800 pages to me is a pretty big sized book. Probably most books I read are, 300 to 500 pages. I say it's like a average book size. I'd say when you get to 600, 700, 800 pages, to me that's a big book. And it takes me quite a while to get through those books, especially if it's more of a educational type book that's really giving you information. It might take me a little longer to get through, and it certainly took me a while to get through this book. There's so much information in there. And one of the most interesting things, reading about the writing of this book, and Mark Lewisohn, such an interesting individual. You can find a lot of YouTube videos of interviews with him and podcasts with interviews. He's been interviewed so many times, and he's very interesting to listen to because he just knows so much about the Beatles. I think no one knows more about the Beatles than him. He's the premier Beatle historian. He is the historian to go to if you want to know anything about the Beatles. And it's interesting, and there's like a really good interview with Conan O'Brien. In fact, Conan O'Brien has a show, or he had a YouTube show where he interviewed people, and Mark Lewisohn is one of the people he interviewed. Definitely check that interview out. And any interview with Mark Lewisohn is very interesting if you like the Beatles, because he just puts out so much information, that even information you never maybe heard, or he talks about maybe myths about the Beatles that are untrue. Because he's done so much research. He's just researched the heck out of the Beatles. But one of the interesting things about Mark Lewisohn, when he did this book, I forgot to see when it came out. It came out some years ago. 2013 is when this book came out. But he started writing it, I think in 2003. He said it took him about 10 years to write this, just the first volume. Like I said, this is just the first book. It took him 10 years to write. So he started back in 2003 when he came with this idea to write this 3-book series on the Beatles. And so that's incredible. I mean, nobody takes 10 years to write it's not just a biography of all the Beatles, just the first 4 years of their career. This only covers about 4 years of the Beatles. It took him 10 years. Now the reason why is because most of that 10 years was researching. He just researched and researched. And the thing to know about Mark Lewisohn is he's done a lot of work in the Beatles. I think books ever since like the 80s he started writing kind of about the Beatles or doing research for other books about the Beatles. He was highly involved with the Beatles anthology series that came out in 1995, I believe. Both the DVD or that was on TV, and also there's a book that goes along with the Beatles anthology. He did a lot of research for that, so he spent a lot of time on the Beatles anthology project, which was a really huge project. The best biography we have of the Beatles, or documentary that we have of the Beatles. And he's worked for different, I know Philip Norman, who's written some books about the Beatles or about the individuals like John and Paul. He worked for him at some points and helped do research with Philip Norman when he was writing his books. So yeah, he's just been really involved with research. So he's mostly known as, and I've heard him in the interviews talk about, he's mostly known to be a researcher, and his career has mostly been about doing research and putting down the facts of what happened. He's really good at that. You can tell in this book, it's so well researched. In fact, I have another book of his, maybe the second most popular book that he's written on the Beatles is the Beatles recording section, the complete Beatles recording sessions. And this is a good sized book there, not very thick, but this is just a book that anytime the Beatles went to a studio and recorded music, either on an album or as singles, every time they went into the studio, it's recorded in that book, and the date, and then it says who was in the recording session, what instruments did they play, how much of the song did they play, did they just play a demo version of the song, did they mix different parts of the song. I mean, everything you want to know about how each song was recorded is in that book. So it's not like the most interesting read as far as a narrative book would be. I mean, I like that kind of stuff, so it was enjoyable for me to kind of go through and just kind of look at the different times that they went to the studio. But yeah, it's an interesting part if you want to know more about the Beatles. And so that's kind of books that he was more into, is research books. And he said so this was the first time he really thought, I'm going to try to write a book that has more of a narrative perspective, where I'm writing a story and not just putting down facts. And so, and he's said, he's already written some books, done some research, so he's known well enough, and he sold enough books for his publishing company that they let him do this. Because I don't know if they just let anybody do this. Spend 10 years writing a book. That's that's insane. You want to write a book, put it out, make money. You're not making any money if you're spend 10 years researching. But it's well paid off, evidently, because this book is really popular, sold a lot of copies, done really well, and the second, third books are going to sell really well too, because of how well this book has done. And so he came with this project to write, and he wanted to write the most researched book he could about the Beatles, and he came up with this idea of doing 3 volumes, kind of going 4-year increments, starting with 1958 to 1962, which this book covers 1958 to 1962, like I said, about 4 years of the lives of the Beatles and other people around the Beatles. So that's incredible. You hear him talking, he travels a lot, goes to different places. I mean, he goes everywhere he can where he can find information about the Beatles, whether it's newspaper articles, recordings, interviewing people. I mean, he's done just incredible work. From what I'm hearing him in interviews, it's just amazing. A part of you just wants to say, get the book done, because you want to read it. 10 years is too long to wait for a book. But then he says it's well worth, all the research to make it, to get it done right. He wants to get it done right. And he's not going to make the book until he feels consciously that he has done his best job to do the most research he can for this subject matter. In fact, he even has, I think on his website, it says, send anything in that you know about the Beatles. If you have a picture of the Beatles or an article about the Beatles, he wants it. He wants as much information as he can about the Beatles to cipher it all out and try to figure out what the truth is of what happened. Anyways, so that's his project. Like I said, it started about 2003, I think, on this one. It took him about 10 years, most of that research. Came out with this book, 2013. What's interesting, another interesting, like I said, 800 pages. This is actually not the full version of the book. This is actually like the abridged version. This is the short, edited version of what he wrote. He actually started out writing, when he finished writing, he had a 1,500-page book. 1,500, about twice the amount of this book, 800, which I say 800 is really, about the longest books I have are about 800 pages personally. And so that's just an incredible amount of information and so much to read. And it comes in, from what I understand, it comes in like this box with 2 books. I mean, they couldn't fit in just one book. It's like 2 books that you read together that can make up the 1,500 pages. So, I mean, he didn't make one huge 1,500 page book, but 2 books that equal 1,500 pages, and it goes in this box that you have to buy. Interesting thing is when he wrote, of course, he wrote this huge 1,500 page book. Of course, the publishing company is like, we can't sell a 1,500 page book. That's way too long. It's going to cost a lot of money to make that kind of book. So we're going to have to, it's going to cost the customer a lot of money to buy the book because it's going to cost us money to print that much. And people don't usually like to buy books that long. Books that huge don't get bought as much. So, publishing companies don't want you to write that big of a book usually. So he actually has 2 publishing companies. One of course, he's from England, so he has an England publishing company, and he has an American publishing company. So he actually has 2 publishing companies that he's working with. And so the English publishing company actually agreed to do the 1,500 page book. That's 2 books basically that comes in a box. They agreed to do that, put that out. The American company did not want to put that out. They told him, we want you to edit that down, half that at least, which he agreed to do, and he did his own editing. So he went through the 1,500 page book and edited out into an 800 page book to what he thought would be, respectable to his work, I guess. And so then the 800 page book that I own, let's tune in all these years, this you can get in any American bookstore, that Barnes & Nobles. Like, I think I bought this at Barnes & Nobles. Of course, you can go on Amazon and get it. Anything, so you can go out and get this book. In America, you cannot get the 1,500 page book at a bookstore. They do not sell the 1,500 page version of this book in America. But you can go on Amazon and buy the 1,500 page book and have it shipped to you from England. I don't have that book. I just have the 800 page book, the abridged version. But the 1,500 page book, I think last time I looked, it was like $100 or something like that. It's very expensive. I mean, this is probably like $30 or something like that, which is fairly pricey to me. I usually pay $20 or something like that for a book. But this is pretty, like I said, pretty good sized book. I think it was about $30 or so dollars. When I looked up the 1,500 page or 2 books, yeah, $100. So that's quite expensive. It's hard for me to go, do I need to pay $100 to buy this book? I don't know. This book is pretty good on its own. I don't know if I need a 1,500 page book when an 800 page book is so more detailed than anything I've ever read before, and has so much information that I've never read before, or not to this extent. I don't know if I really need a 1,500 page book. So I don't know. I haven't. It's like if I want to be, I guess, a Beatle completist, I could go get the 1,500 page book, but I'm so satisfied with this book that right now I don't feel like I need it. But I don't know. I feel I'm a true hardcore Beatle fan. I suppose a real hardcore Beatle fan maybe would get the 1,500 page book, but right now I'm satisfied. So I'd say that's to me, it's just boggling, interesting information that I've never heard somebody writing a 1,500 page book, and just one volume, just 4 years of the Beatles' lives, and putting it out there. That'd take forever. Like I said, this took me a while to read. That would take me a really long time to read. So that's kind of more about Mark Lewisohn and his writing. Just talk a little bit about maybe the book itself and my opinion on it. Because I've read a couple Beatle biographies, and I have some biographies of like all the individual Beatles, and like I said, he did 10 years to write, and he says most Beatle biographers spend maybe a year or two writing a Beatles book, maybe a year of research or less, and then writing it. So I mean, he's not only doubled, tripled the amount of time a normal biographer would and that's just writing about the whole career of the Beatles. He's just writing just a little part of the Beatles. Anyways, in my opinion, I would say the book is probably too long. There's too much detail. Like I said, he's really into detail, really into research. I would say maybe it's too long and it's too much information, and a lot of information I don't know if I really even need. I think maybe that's why a normal Beatle book maybe be 500 pages and it covers the whole career, or 600 pages or something like that. And I don't know, books don't need to be really long. They can get a little tiring reading a long book. You know, you need, like watching a movie, you need to be paced out so it's interesting throughout. You don't want boring parts of the book. And then it gets a little hard reading, and then you kind of put it down, and then, like, I usually put it down, don't read it for several months, and then go, oh, I need to go back to reading that. But it's such a slog to get through because just too much information. You know, I love the Beatles. It's just so much information. Even that, you know, it gets hard to read after a while. And you just feel like you're never going to finish it. You keep reading, you're like, I'm never finishing this book. The book's taking me years to read. That's why I am with books when they're really long. So in my opinion, I don't know, but I mean, I see why he did it. I mean, and he says, of course, he's a huge Beatles fan, and he says, you know, Beatles are worth writing a big book about, which I agree. The Beatles are one of my favorite, like I said, things to read about, subjects. So I understand, yeah, they're one of the, if anybody is worth a big book, it's the Beatles, because of what they, like I said, culturally, musically, what they've done. Still, I don't know, it's hard to get through. I admit, you have to be a hardcore Beatles fan, I think, probably to get through this book, and love to read to get through this book. Personally, I'd probably just rather read a Beatles biography that covers the whole career and takes only 500 pages or something like that. A little bit easier to, I mean, a little faster to read, and you get all the information. Like I said, anyways, talking about this book, he's of course, volume 1, he's working on volume 2 right now, and then he'll do volume 3, which I think he's kind of doing volume 2 and volume 3 right now. He's doing a lot of research he says, for both books. So I don't know if that means the third book will come out quicker. I don't know. Like I said, this came out in 2013. He's still working on the second book, and it's 2021 right now. So we're talking 8 years. So it's been 8 years since the first volume, and he's still working on it. On his website, he says that it's not going to come out, obviously not going to come out this year. He says it's not going to come out next year, 2022, but he says 2023, it's possible. He might possibly be done by 2023, which would be 10 years from this book. So it's like, that's a possibility. But and then he says, anyways, so when I hear 2023 maybe, it sounds like maybe it'll be. So to me, I think 2024 is probably when it's going to come out. Because it seems like anytime someone says, you know, maybe it'll come out, we're going to try to come out on this date, it never comes out on the date they want. So my guess, it could come out 2023, but personally, I'm not going to hold my breath until 2024. That's definitely, I definitely hope it comes out in 2024, which is like 2.5 years, 3 years from now. So it's still some time to wait, which that's incredible waiting this long for a second. But man, how exciting the second book's going to be. I think it's going to be the best book in the series, I would think. Because like I said, this book, it's a little boring. For me, in my opinion, a little boring. I think it gets good though in about 600 pages in. The last 200 pages are actually really good. They're the best part of the book for sure. And a lot of that's just because the book covers a lot of the Beatles, you know, the birth and, you know, where their parents and grandparents, and goes through a lot of that stuff, and, you know, they're growing up. But it really gets in detail in 1958. 1958, he does this thing. I've never seen another biographer do this, which is interesting, is that he goes month by month. He goes, okay, here's what happens in January of 1958. And he just goes, lists like almost like every day. Okay, on January 1st this happened, on January 2nd this happened, anyways, and he just goes day by day of that month, and then, all right, this is what happened in February 1958. So you're just going month by month, seeing what they've done, which not everything they do is interesting, obviously, especially early on, because they weren't doing a whole lot. They were still learning to be a band. They still weren't a band. It was still just John and Paul, and then George enters in, and then Ringo doesn't enter in until much later. And so there's not a lot going on except they getting together and practicing, and of course they go to Hamburg. Maybe the most interesting things about, you know, the early career, and kind of really learning to be a band. But it's not until, you know, 1961, 1962. This book ends ends December 31st of 1962. So the very last day of 1962, this is where the book ends. So the second book's going to start right at January 1st, 1963. Anyways, that's how he kind of does the book. So you go month by month until the very last day of the year. And so, if you know the Beatles, of course, nothing really happens till about 1962, 1963 is when stuff starts really rolling for the Beatles. Obviously, because they weren't, they didn't have a contract with a record company until 1962, I believe. Didn't meet Brian Epstein until around that time, and get a manager, which things really go up. So, like I said, about 600 pages in, it gets interesting because that's when they finally get like a manager, Brian Epstein, and then they get signed by EMI, and George Martin becomes the producer, and then they're working on making music. They haven't made at the end of this book in 1962, they haven't made a album yet. Their first album didn't come out in 1963, Please Please Me. So, but they do have some singles. They talk about some songs they're working on. They come out with one single, Love Me Do. It was the first single that came out, and that came out at the end of 1962. And did fairly well. Not a number one hit, but like number 19, I think, in England. So as far as you get, but it does get interesting when you start talking about meeting George Martin. Of course, then they fire Pete Best, hire Ringo, and then that's when it feels like, okay, now we're the Beatles. We got all four members. We got George Martin in the picture. That's when it gets real interesting. And there's a lot of information on George Martin that's really interesting that I didn't know about. A lot of information on Brian Epstein I didn't know about. So there's definitely some more information about other people besides the Beatles, which I like, learning about everybody around the Beatles. But yeah, it gets real interesting when they're talking to George Martin, and George Martin's trying to decide, what am I going to do with this new band? And George Martin's not a rock and roll person, so he's like, here I got this band, and they have a good sound, I think. We can do something with them. Obviously, the most interesting thing when reading it is to think, oh yeah, nobody knows they're going to be the biggest band in the world. Nobody knows Beatlemania is coming around the corner, that they're just going to change the scene totally. Nobody knows that. They just know here's a good-looking group of four lads that have pretty good sound. Who knows? Maybe they'll be big. Maybe they will fizzle out. Maybe nothing will happen. They don't know. We know because we're in the future right now. But I do think it's interesting. George Martin. The interesting story, of course, you probably heard before, is that he didn't know that. Again, he didn't know Lennon and McCartney were going to be the greatest songwriting duo of all time. So when they came out and they said, "Here's some songs that we've written," and he plays them like "Love Me Do" and some other ones. "P.S. I Love You," I think, is the B-side of "Love Me Do." So they come up with these songs that they've written. They provide it they show it to George Martin, and it's interesting. George Martin's not that impressed with what he's hearing. He's like, I don't think these songs are ready for be a big hit. In his opinion, "Love Me Do" was the closest. I guess he thought, well, "Love Me Do" is passable, that it might do something. Of course, then it does. It goes 19, like I said, so it does fairly well. Not number one hit, but still, it's something. And "P.S. I Love You," I guess he thought was good enough to be the B-side. But for most of the songs that Lennon and McCartney was showing George Martin, he was not impressed by them and didn't think they would make it. So he went out to look for, which is popular at the day, is just to go out and get songs that are already written and then rearrange it for a group. And the more I've listened to albums and do research, almost every band, that's the way every band works. There's hardly any bands at this time period that write their own original material. Anyway, so that just wasn't a thing. Today, I think every band writes their own material. That's just what you do. But it's like, no, sometimes you get other people to write for you. Because we know the Beatles, of course, have written a lot of their own material about Hard Day's Night, and then Most of Help, and then Rubber Soul On. It's all original. So we know the Beatles are great original writers. Of course, at this time they didn't know it, so he comes up with a song called "How Do You Do," I think. How do you do what you do? And he thinks this is the number one hit, and so he says, he gives it to the Beatles and says, "Okay, record this song. I think you can make a number one hit out of it." And they probably could have. I think it definitely would have been a number one hit if the Beatles did it. It's not a bad tune. Martin ended up giving it to Jerry and the Pacemakers, and it was a number one tune for them. So Jerry and the Pacemakers could get a number one tune out of it. You would think the Beatles could too. But John and Paul and especially they wanted one of their songs to be the single, not somebody else's song. And so they fought on it, which was a bold move for the Beatles, because the Beatles were nobody. John and Lennon and McCartney were nobodies at that time. So for them to stand up to George Martin and say, no, we want to do our own song, I mean, who knows what would have happened. I mean, Martin, they could, I don't know if they could fire the Beatles at that point. They had a contract, but, they might not have, Martin might not have played well with them at that point. But Martin conceded, and of course they talk about Please Please Me at the end of this book. I don't think it didn't come out yet until 1963 as a single, and it was their first #1 single in England. So it does talk about them doing Please Please Me and him saying, quicken it up, it's too slow, all this stuff. And then so Lennon rearranged it, added harmonica, I think, and of course we know it now is a really great song and their first #1 hit. But that's interesting information. I really like that kind of information about Martin not really knowing what to do with the Beatles at the beginning. The other thing I thought was interesting is, like I said, when Martin saw them, one of the discussions he had was, who's the lead singer of the band? Who should we put down as the lead singer to sing all these songs? Because he saw when they auditioned, both John Lennon and Paul McCartney were, trading off songs, I think, and so he knew he had two people that could sing, John Lennon and Paul McCartney. Of course, not including George Harrison, could sing some too, but definitely John and Paul were the two strongest singers in the group for sure. And so George Martin had this, decision, because I think most bands at the time, you had a lead singer. You had one lead singer, one guy, Buddy Holly and the Crickets, of course, it was Buddy Holly. Of course, you had Elvis, and all this, Roy Orbison. You had one lead singer in a group, and not all of those are groups maybe, but yeah, you have one lead singer that sings all your songs, basically. And so he had to make a decision, okay, who's going to be the lead singer, John or Paul? And then he came up with this idea that I didn't know that was even a thing, because we just know them as, John and Paul are two really great singers, and kind of trade off. John maybe even more than Paul, but they somewhat trade off, half-half, and then George does a couple and Ringo does one. But he kind of came to this decision that, oh, maybe we can have two lead singers, which I think was like a new idea at the time, which is genius of George Martin. I kind of, when I read this, I think, man, George Martin was just a genius at music and how to rearrange it and how to get a good hit, and that's why Beatles were as big as they were, because they had a great producer in George Martin. And so I thought that was a really interesting idea, like, oh, I didn't know that would be a discussion, that there had to be one lead singer, and then decide, you know what, maybe we can have two, which is bizarre, because why can't you have two? That makes total sense. I don't know if that's today. I don't know if they think about it in those terms, one lead singer. Why can't just anybody sing? And there's a lot of bands after this that multiple people are singing lead, so it's not a big deal who sings lead if you sometimes have multiple lead singers. Anyway, so that's the other really interesting information, like I said. So yeah, it's the last 200, really good stuff. Really makes you excited for the next book. I'm really excited for the second one, like I said, because it's going to start in 1963. So once we get the next book, we're going to start with, it's like Please Please Me, and then the album Please Please Me, and She Loves You, I Want to Hold Your Hand are going to be huge singles. You're going to get Beatlemania, they're going to tour in England or in Europe, and then of course once you get to 1964 and they get to America, and then it really blows up in America with Ed Sullivan Show, and then I'm guessing it's going to go over Hard Day's Night and Help, because I'm guessing he's going to go over probably 63 to, I'm guessing, 66, and then the third book is going to be probably 67 to 1970 is my guess, is around there. So yeah, so if you're a huge Beatles fan, you like to read it all, if you're hardcore, like I said, this is a must. I mean, definitely a must book for any Beatles fan that wants to know more information. Definitely give that a read, even though it's a little lengthy, might take a little time. Definitely learn a lot. Anyway, so that's my book review. Thank you for watching the channel, and I hope this was interesting information to you. I like to do some more book reviews maybe in the future, about the Beatles mostly. That's what I got. So just thank you, and thank you for subscribing and liking my videos. I appreciate you.